Good morning. My name is Angelica Lacey. I am a former senior park aide from the California State Railroad Museum, and I will be your host today for this presentation. Today, we are here to acknowledge Juneteenth, a holiday typically celebrated on June 19th to commemorate the announcements that slaves were free in 1865. Growing up, Juneteenth was important in my household as it was a time to attend festivals, parades, picnics, and dances, and reflect on African American history while supporting Black-owned businesses. It was a day that we recognized the hardships of our ancestors through activities that brought us joy and community. The celebrations were hyper-focused on good food and good company. There are often rich and colorful selections of soul food at Juneteenth events. The food can range from jambalaya, okra, gumbo, catfish, to smothered oxtails, and more. As a kid, this was and still is my favorite part of attending a Juneteenth event. I did not know until later that the majority of the food was originally created through the scraps and leftovers discarded by slave owners as they picked through the food that they didn't want to eat. Black people have always had to take what little was given to them and make it something of it, which is the narrative of their story. Please listen to the following video message from my friend and colleague, George Palmer, as he delves deeper into the history of this holiday.
Good morning. My name is George Palmer. I'm a volunteer here at the California State Railroad Museum for the last 21 years. Of that 21 years, 18 as a tour guide. Juneteenth, we're talking about Juneteenth. How did Juneteenth come to be? When President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, making it effective January 1st, 1863, this information never reached Texas until 2 years later when General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, freeing the last of the slaves. Texas was the last of the southern rebellious states, and quite often there was hardly any battles fought in Texas. And when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, did he free all of the slaves? No, he did not. He only freed the slaves in the 11 rebellious states. At the time, there were 15 slave states in the country. He did not free the slaves in Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And not only that, he stayed 48 counties in Virginia. Those 48 counties went on to become the state of West Virginia in 1865. And only one or two states joined the Union during the Civil War, and the second was Nevada. Juneteenth had been talked about and promoted for quite a while. And as you know, it was not the end of slavery. 2 years after Lincoln had signed that emancipation, as General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, freeing the last of the slaves. And in 1866, African Americans started Juneteenth to celebrate the end of slavery. But as we know it, the end of slavery did not come about until the 13th Amendment was adopted to the Constitution on December the 18th, 1865. And from that, the Juneteenth started being celebrated across the country. Really, the African Americans around in the 1890s started calling it Juneteenth. And it started to spread across the country as the end of slavery. Juneteenth is called many things. It was also known as Freedom Day, Black Independence Day, and Jubilee Day. What had happened since then when, after the United States banned the importation of slaves in 1808 from Africa, the domestic slave trading became very, very popular because of the development of cotton, but also the development of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. And here, these Southerners needed labor. Here enters Isaac Franklin and John Ormsby, who developed one of the largest slave trading companies in this country and became very rich from around 1828 to 1861. And the many of the slaves that they would transport by foot was very, it was a long, hard ordeal until the 1840s when they found two different transportation modes, steamboats and the railroad. Made it much better and much easier to transport these slaves throughout from the upper South to the lower South, where they would need it for these new crops of cotton and tobacco, since Eli Whitney had developed the cotton gin. In Alabama, between 1808 and in the Civil War, the enslaved population in Alabama around 1808 was around 40,000 African Americans. But by the end of the Civil War, it had grown from 40,000 to 430,000 African Americans enslaved in Alabama. Had one of the highest rates of slaves in the country at that time. And in 1938, Texas recognized Emancipation Day for African Americans, and that's the way it was in 1938. The governor issued an order there indicating that it would be celebrated on June the 19th, but never on Sunday. If it was Sunday, it had to be moved to a Monday, so it was not on the weekends. And after he moved to then Al Edwards, he was a Texas state legislator. He introduced a bill in 1979 to make it a paid holiday for Texans, and it became the law in 1980 that it became a paid holiday for Texans. A congresswoman out of Michigan in 1997 got it started in Congress, and finally it was pushed through, and in June 17, 21st, President Biden signed it into law as a federal holiday in this country. Now, the last quite a few states had already had set aside Juneteenth as a holiday, except for a while 3 states, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Hawaii. But as of now, all 50 states have recognized Juneteenth as a holiday, and that's the way it stands now in this country. It's quite a celebration for Juneteenth. As a docent for Colonel Allensworth and Status in California State Park in Tulare County, I was a volunteer there for from 1995 to 2018. And on Juneteenth, they had a senior citizen group that would put on quite a dance down there. I would always love to go and do tours on that time, but I always took the time to make sure I never missed these senior citizens dancing. They could put on quite a dance. Nothing like our youngsters do today, but I'm sure some of the young people are following in those footsteps. But Juneteenth was instituted as a sense of heritage and to recognize the culture as the contributions African Americans have made in this country. And we hope you will take the time to go to some of the celebrations involving Juneteenth. And we had that celebration last year at the Mormon Center. In October, they filmed quite a few African Americans talking about different subjects for the African American history. I did Juneteenth, and that they videotaped it, and it was shown this past March, right after February, in 8 states and Puerto Rico for the first time. And as we have one granddaughter, and she is also in private school. They are teaching her about the cultures of different classmates. And so I asked her, she's now in the 4th grade, I said, sweetheart, do you know why February is picked for Black History Month? She said, of course, Grandpa, it's to honor the birth dates of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass on the 14th. I said, very good, sweetheart. And so we hope that you will learn something about this great contribution, the oldest African American celebration in the country, and it is now being shown nationwide and is now a federal holiday thanks to a President Biden administration. Thank you.
What an eye-opening presentation from George. You may now be wondering, how can you acknowledge, celebrate, and uplift African Americans beyond Juneteenth? One of the best ways to do this is to support or donate to your local Black-owned businesses. A few in the Sacramento area include the Sojourner Truth African Heritage Museum, the Underground Bookstore, Fixin' Soul Kitchen, Slim and Husky's Pizzeria, and the Sacramento Black Chamber of Commerce. To find more Black-owned businesses nationwide, visit supportblackowned.com. Now, let's transition to what followed the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the events of Juneteenth. Low-wage jobs slowly became more available to African Americans. One of the crucial roles that some of the first ex-slaves filled was that of Pullman porters on luxury railroad sleeper cars in the late 1860s. The following video from the Oakland History Museum explains these duties in depth.
George Pullman was an entrepreneur. He was a man who was associated with the railroads and the business of railroads, and really got this light bulb of an idea, because in the years slightly after the Civil War, we're talking about 1867, 1868, railroad travel was still pretty rough, and of course the industry was growing. People traveled by the railroad, in the railroads, and the cars were cramped, they were smoky, they were dirty. It was not a very convenient way to travel. So Pullman came up with the idea that if we could make these cars, these so-called luxury cars, where people could travel in comfort, that would be certainly a boon to business, and he could sell these cars and make a fortune. That was his whole idea behind what became known as the Pullman cars, this luxurious way to travel. And concomitant with that thought, that train of thought, was that, well, if you have luxury cars and people have all the fancy amenities, like staying in a fancy hotel, well, you would like to, maybe you would like to be served in the same way, in the same capacity. And what better way, Pullman thought, of fulfilling this dream and this fantasy of a lot of passengers, was to have Black folks wait on them. A Pullman porter, his job was basically to attend to the needs of the white passengers on the trains. That ran the gamut from shining shoes to attending to the sick, to certainly serving the meals, making down the berths, making the berths for the passengers, and anything else that a passenger really wanted. But this group of men a lot of them coming out of the South, not the majority necessarily. But if there was any opportunity to free oneself from the drudgery of agricultural labor or the dangers of industrial labor, that a lot of factory jobs that black people had to take in the South, sharecropping aside, you would do it. And so if an opportunity presented itself that you could work on this train, however long the hours and demeaning the conditions, at least the most dangerous animal on the trains were often the passengers themselves. The tips and the salary that the porters were paid as a group afforded them a lot of the luxuries, I guess, that would affect the quality of their lives that were not available to an average African American working as a custodian or some other form of menial labor. This disposable income or extra income, especially from the tips that could be made, allowed Pullman porters to care for their families and their extended families to a greater extent than they would have been otherwise. It afforded them the opportunity to purchase homes and property. It afforded them the opportunity to purchase automobiles, for example. These are all items that were certainly available to most well-to-do consumers and not to the a large majority of the American public, regardless of race. So this kind of employment allowed Pullman porters to move into an area that we would today classify as sort of like the middle class. They were middle class within the black community itself, and so they were the sort of the catalyst for a lot of businesses that were started wherever they decided to live, and a lot of the places were terminal points of the railroad, like here in Oakland, where we had the terminus of the Southern Pacific Railroad was right here in West Oakland, and many of them decided they liked California, they were going to stay in California, and thus they contributed to the jump-starting the African American community here in Oakland. So in terms of community building, for the black community, they're essential. They're not the only ones, I might add, but they're very important. And here in Oakland, one of the I guess most important things that the Pullman porters are known for is the founding of the first black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, founded under the direction of A. Philip Randolph. But A. Philip Randolph had a very staunch and a very capable right-hand man who lived in Oakland at the time. The union was founded, I think, 1925, that they founded the union. Well, there was a man by the name of C.L. Dellums here in Oakland who became a Pullman porter and became the West Coast representative of the Pullman porters for many years. Not only that, in addition to being a West Coast representative of the Pullman porters and a key right-hand man to A. Philip Randolph, we're standing here in the Archives Department of the African American Museum and Library at Oakland, otherwise known as AMLO. We have three departments: the museum department, our reference department, and archives. And the archives is a very important department here. We have lots of visits from researchers and scholars in the general public who are interested in researching one aspect or another of African American history, and we're happy to say that if they're coming to do some research on the Pullman porters, we've got quite a few things that they can dig into. We are here looking at a few items, mainly from one collection. It's the J.J. Bryant collection, donated by Mrs. Bryant several years ago, and it's just a really rich collection. We're really proud of it. This is a photograph of J.J. Bryant outside one of his workstations, and you can see he's got his full uniform on, and he's ready to work. Must have been cold out there. He's got a big, thick pair of gloves on. And if you pan over here, you can see this is actually his jacket that he's wearing in this photograph. We have his cap, as you can see, is rather well worn. Pullman Porter cap, and he definitely wanted to let you know it was Pullman who's calling the shots. I mentioned earlier we were talking about the importance of the Pullman Porters being the first black trade union. And I mentioned the importance of a man on the West Coast who was a right-hand man for A. Philip Randolph, who was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And to his right in this picture is C.L. Dellums, a very important figure. In fact, he was the president of what they call the Fourth International. So you hold a high rank in the governing body of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. We mentioned the importance of unionization, which was fought for almost 15 years. They fought to be recognized as a legitimate labor union affiliated with the American Federation of Labor. And this is a little pamphlet that came out signed by Ashley Totten, who was the General Secretary Treasurer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and A. Philip Randolph, and just asking why every porter should join the Brotherhood and pay dues. And there's a sort of a 19-point list of why. Some of the listings here says, because the Brotherhood has stood firm against great opposition for over 5 years. Because the Brotherhood has won a $2 million wage increase, or $120 a year more than when the union began, for 12,000 porters. And that's very significant. When you talk about a $120 raise in 1920s, 30s, or 40s, that's a significant raise. That was not only a great raise, it would have been just a great salary. Here's another one having to do with salary. Because the Brotherhood has put $420 more in wages inside the pockets of every porter in the last 5 years in the form of 2 wage increases of $5 each. Doesn't sound like much to us today, but at the time this was written, that was a big deal. What countered the menial nature of these positions, and they understood this, was a level of respect that these guys had within their own communities. They were looked upon as being the professionals. They had a job, they wore a uniform, they were conversant, they had seen the world. They crossed the country back and forth. They brought news. They could discuss issues that the locals didn't know anything about. And not only that, they would demonstrate their commitment in various ways, as I mentioned, by spreading the money around. By purchasing home and property. And you could point to, that's Mr. So-and-so's house. Oh, he's a Pullman porter. Oh, great. Oh, but not only just spending their money in conspicuous ways, but also supporting churches, youth organizations, those kinds of activities that gave them the kind of cachet and prestige in their communities that seemed kind of, it's incongruous when you think of, you're still working, you're still a servant. Well, most black people at the time, those are the kinds of jobs that were giving us. They were all subservient kinds of positions. But it depends on how you dealt with it psychologically and in terms of surviving and improving the quality of your life and the lives of your family. And by extrapolation, over the years, the quality of life for those who lived in your community.
The role of the Pullman Porters, African-American men who traveled all over the country, was indeed an important role and brought value and cultural knowledge to the African-American community they returned to. Some porters would bring back African-American newspapers to their homes in the South that detailed where they could migrate and find safer areas away from the violence they experienced in their homes. As the video discussed, though this was a menial job, it was one of the best jobs out there for Black men to attain. Their tips and salaries were placed into penny jars, which became their mini personal banks. that they somehow stretched to support themselves and their families in a way that other jobs were not as capable of doing for them. Though they were underpaid and struggling, they were doing better than most in their community. However, their lives were still full of hardship. To put it plainly, they had the best of the worst jobs that the state made available to them as Black Americans. The hours they worked were long. 400 hours of work each month was mandatory. They would frequently work 20-hour shifts and only have enough time to sleep 3 to 4 hours at a time. When not assisting passengers on the train directly, they were to be invisible and out of sight, and they slept in cramped quarters. Many of the Pullman porters on the train were called George by the passengers, after George Pullman, the owner of the luxury cars. There were many reasons behind this, one being that it was a callback to slavery, as it related each Pullman porter to one white man in the same way that slaves that were shipped from Africa were given the surnames of their white masters, so that it was clear who their owner was. Another was that it stripped their individuality and made them all the same in the eyes of the passengers, as they would all be forced to answer to one name. It was very demeaning. In addition to the Pullman porters, there were also Pullman maids, African-American women who served the white women and children on the trains. Their main duties included babysitting, styling hair, and giving manicures. They were outnumbered by the Pullman porters, as there was only one maid to a car, while dozens of Pullman porters may be available in the same car. It was very competitive to get a job as a Pullman maid, as it was seen as more respectable than being an ordinary maid, with the added opportunity to travel and see the world. In 1925, the Pullman maids were right beside the Pullman porters to battle to form a union for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is also known by the name the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. With guidance from A. Philip Randolph, forming this union would allow the unfair working conditions of the Pullman porters and maids to change, as their unreasonable long work hours would be cut and their low pay to be rectified. This, unfortunately, was a long battle that lasted 12 years, as the Pullman company put up every firewall to stall such a change that would put an end to the cheap labor they had been reaping for so many years. In 1937, the Pullman company finally signed an agreement to unionize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And as this video depicted, a raise of $120 was attained, as well as a decrease in the long work hours to allow these employees the rest that they desperately needed. This also allowed the International Ladies Auxiliary to form, which was an adjunct organization for the wives and female relatives of union members. Their primary purpose was to fundraise and disperse information on behalf of the union. The legacy of the Pullman porters and maids made an impact beyond the railroad. Even after the Pullman company ended the sleeper car service back in 1969, due to the emergence of the automobile and airplane, their influence is still felt all of these decades later. They were critical participants in the civil rights movement. They were a major catalyst of the Great Migration, which was the movement of many African Americans from the South to the North in the hope to find better lives and escape the violence and segregation that was ensued by the Jim Crow era. The news that the Pullman porters brought from their travels to their families in the South was crucial to these journeys. The Pullman porters scrimped and saved for their children so that they may attend college, graduate school, and get an array of advanced degrees, putting forward generations of doctors, lawyers, politicians, artists, journalists, etc. And these generations must continue to do the work that is needed to be done for the generations after them, as the African American struggle is not over. Thank you to everyone who joined us today on this forum. Perhaps in the future, we can have another discussion. Have a great rest of your day and happy Juneteenth.